When you are learning, you're not learning passively. You're not just sort of trying something and then it didn't work. The inquiry into their failure, the weaknesses of their vision, they are hungry for that stuff with an almost predatory intensity.
Your non-entrepreneurial friends will say, Chris, why do you want to go do that? It's so risky. You have such a stable, good job and you'd have to work so hard. Actually, you are risking more than I am. You're risking using your precious time working on someone else's dream. Choose your hard.
The obstinate are like boats whose rudders can't be turned. The persistent are like boats whose engines can't be throttled back.
You're listening to the Startup Podcast. This is an educational episode.
Hi, I'm Yaniv Bernstein.
And I'm Chris Saad.
And in today's episode, are you the good sort of stubborn or the bad sort of stubborn? Well, in today's episode, we're going to analyze one of Paul Graham's amazing essays where he talks about the difference between being persistent, which is the absolute key to startup success, and being obstinate, which is only the road to getting a very sore head. You want to understand the difference between this so you can get it right. We will tell you all about it right after the break. Today's episode of the Startup Podcast is brought to you by .tech domains. One thing about starting your startup that should be easy but isn't is naming it. Why is it so hard? Because all the good .com domain names are taken. So you end up doing something silly like misspelling it or adding random prefixes or suffixes. No more. Your domain shows your focus and intent, so you should make it sharp, clean, and unmistakably tech with a .tech domain. Head to get.tech/TSP or a registrar like GoDaddy to grab your .tech domain today. That's www.get.tech/TSP for the Startup Podcast. Okay, so Chris, Picasso had his blue period. Well, here on the Startup Podcast, we have a Paul Graham period where both of us, I think, right in the middle of Paul Graham's amazing series of essays about startups. Paul Graham, for those of you who don't already know, is the founder of Y Combinator and one of the clearest thinkers about what makes that Silicon Valley mindset special and unique. And so there's an essay that he wrote that I think we've touched on this topic quite a few times, Chris, and I think it's really valuable. And it's about the difference between, in his words, being obstinate and being persistent, right? So this is a question of you don't want to give up, but then you should know when to quit. And I've always struggled to have a clear intellectual framework for what's the difference between just not knowing when to quit and being someone who gives up too easily, right? And because you need both in startups. And what I think Paul Graham has done here, and we're going to dive into some of the content, is provide a really clear framework, a distinction between what he calls these two different kinds of stubbornness, or the right kind of stubborn. So we thought we'd go through this article and dissect what's in it.
Yeah. In this article, he frames it as obstinate versus persistent. You can also frame it as dogmatic versus disciplined, or visionary versus delusional, right? There are these trade-offs you have to make as someone who's trying to manifest your will into the world, where the line between crazy and brilliant is very, very fine. And you need to know when you are winning and changing hearts and minds, changing the world for the better, and when you are just pushing shit uphill that shouldn't be up there. So I think this is going to be a really important conversation to help people try to figure that out for themselves.
And so let's jump in. Paul Graham has kind of created this distinction between persistence and obstinacy, right? And so they're both kinds of stubbornness, right? And I think it's important as a startup, as PG says himself, successful people tend to be persistent. They don't give up easily. New ideas often don't work at first, but those people are not deterred. They know what they're trying to build and they keep doing it. That's why we say we experiment, we iterate. We should be embarrassed about the first version of our product. All of this is saying we don't give up at the first hurdle, right? We try and we try again.
Yeah, and the key part of this is that failure is part of the process. So oftentimes, when you do these fireside chats with universities or with, cohorts of startups, you get invited to talk to share your sage advice. And they always talk about, tell us a little bit about how you failed and how failure is okay. And I'm often quick to point out, failure isn't okay. Failure is essential. Failure is part of the process. So feeling like you are being persistent in the face of failure is entirely the feeling you're supposed to be having. And so just, again, knowing when this clear-eyed persistence is turning into pushing, obstinance and stubbornness is very difficult to figure out.
That's right. The road to success is paved with failure. And so actually, to continue that metaphor, Paul Graham himself, he says, mere obstinacy, on the other hand, is a recipe for failure. obstinate people are so annoying. They won't listen. They beat their heads against a wall and get nowhere, right? So what's the difference between those things, right? What is the key difference? And we've all seen people like this. You see startup founders who are just on the path to failure. Everybody can see it except them. And you can kind of admire their obstinacy. You can kind of admire their tolerance for pain, their unwillingness to give up. But you know that they're not getting any closer to succeeding. You know, ultimately, this thing will end in failure. So what is the difference between these two things other than, in hindsight, looking back and seeing whether ultimately a person succeeded or not? Now, to hear Paul Graham tell it, and this is the key penny drop insight for me that I think is so valuable, it is whether the person is adapting or not, right? It is whether the person is learning from each failure, and then the next try they try something different, right? That saying, right? The definition of stupidity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. So that's what the obstinate person does, Chris, right? They tried something, it didn't work. They basically try the same thing again. It still doesn't work. Now, the persistent person doesn't do that. They have a high level goal. They know they have a destination in mind. But every time they try something and they fail, they learn. They update their mental model. And the next thing they try is actually built on top of the lessons from the failure, right? So you are seeking a way through this wall or a way around this wall. You're not just bashing your head against it over and over and over again. And that really is such a key distinction and a key skill for founders to master the difference between.
Yes, of course, that's key. Now, but then you run into the next tension, which is agility and adaptability versus thrash. So there is this kind of balancing act you need to perform from being stubborn to being persistent, but being persistent while learning and adapting, but not being thrashy. There's a sort of second order tension that you need to walk in your journey to be persistent, but not stubborn.
Well, I'm going to keep quoting from this article because Paul Graham's such a great writer and it really illustrates these things well. And look, he says, I can't think of anyone more determined than the Collison brothers. So those are the founders of Stripe. And when you point out a problem to them, they not only listen, but listen with an almost predatory intensity. With an almost predatory intensity. I love that. Is there a hole in the bottom of their boat? Probably not. But if there is, they want to know about it. So I love that predatory intensity word, right? Because it's saying that, you know, when you are learning, you're not learning passively. You're not just sort of trying something and then it didn't work. And you're like, that didn't work. Maybe there's a lesson there. They are hungry. They are predatory, right? So they treat the inquiry into their failure, the weaknesses of their vision. They are hungry for that stuff, right? So the best founders, they don't give up. They don't lack ambition. The Collison brothers haven't given up on Stripe every time an obstacle came in their way, but they were nearly paranoid, right? They were like, here are all the things that we thought that were wrong, because those wrong things are getting in the way of us being able to achieve our vision. So, you know, in a sense, it relates to like a growth mindset too.
Yeah, another word for predatory, which is a really creative and vivid term for this, they're relentless, right? And they're obsessed with the details. So too many times when you talk to a founder about a possible issue, they have this, even not just founders, but product managers, operators, and so on, they sort of tend to have this laissez-faire attitude with it. Like they'll hear the signal and they'll go, you know, I'm sure it'll be fine. Or, well, you know, either way works. Or, I'll get to that later. Whereas you can notice with great operators, they hear some signal and they go, tell me more about that. Tell me what the sponsoring thought is behind that. Why do you think that's a problem? And they care about the tiniest of details to make sure that this thing is going to be absolutely amazing, elevated execution. While they may not listen to your precise prescription, and this is great product management as well, they're listening for the thought behind the thought. Why is this person confused? Or why do they think there's an issue here? Or what am I maybe missing in this signal? And they apply, and you know, this is true, I assume, of the Stripe guys as well. It's not just about listening to what the person in front of them said, but about filtering it through craft, through experience, through taste, and through judgment, and saying, here's what I think they're really thinking or what they're really pointing to. And I'm going to just tweak one word, one phrase, one pixel to make sure that that gets covered off for the people who think like them or who arrived at that cul-de-sac that they arrived at. It requires a lot of craft, actually.
So I think there's a few things there. Like, to me, what you're describing is what it means to listen, to truly listen. This is whether you are listening to your life partner or to your users or to your investors or anything else. Listening isn't just hearing. It's not just absorbing the words. It is the art of understanding what the other person, the other perspective, or the art of understanding what you've learned from the world. And that's why true listening is not about thrashing, Chris. It is about this deep understanding. And so, yes, I think the obstinate person blocks their ears and doesn't listen. When there is an inconvenient truth, they deny that truth and they just try that thing again, over and over again. And even if everyone around them sees that truth, they have closed their ears to them. Whereas the persistent runs towards that inconvenient truth. That is what PG means by this predatory hunger, right? They're like, let me learn all the weaknesses of my plans, of my idea, the ways in which they don't match reality, so that I can eliminate, ruthlessly, brutally eliminate those weaknesses until I am finally able to succeed. That is persistence. The obstinate person does not do that. The obstinate person just keeps going in the same direction, no matter what reality is telling them. There's another beautiful metaphor in there, right? The reason, Paul Graham says, that the persistent and the obstinate seem similar is that they're both hard to stop, but they're hard to stop in different senses. The persistent are like boats whose engines can't be throttled back. The obstinate are like boats whose rudders can't be turned. Again, a really profound metaphor in my view.
That is a really great metaphor. It brings to mind, it's not exactly related to this, but it brings to mind this point about falling in love with the problem and not falling in love with the solution, right? So somebody who's obstinate is like, no, I'm going to build this Ferrari and it's going to look like this. And I want it to, versus someone who says, you know what? I need to get people from A to B. In living with that problem and running experiments and trying things out, I'm going to attenuate my idea of the solution until I find a way that it works. So this metaphor that he's got of the engine versus the rudder, I think, is a really, really great one. There is a little bit, though. I've said this already in the episode, and I say it a lot in every episode. There's two implicit assumptions in all of the advice you get from Paul Graham and others, which is it requires good taste and judgment. It requires that you learn the right lessons and you apply them well and you don't thrash. And it also requires a little bit of hindsight. Being crazy and right is brilliant. Being crazy and wrong is insane. And sometimes you don't know until it's all over. You just got to realize that, in all the advice we give you, and all the advice Paul Graham gives you, and all of the startup axioms of like move fast and break things and fail fast and hire slow and fire fast, all of these things assume some amount of taste, judgment, or Paul Graham sitting on your shoulder as part of a Y Combinator cohort. And also a lot of the stories you hear from Stripe guys and YouTube guys and whatever, there's a bit of a luck and a bit of hindsight is 2020 as well.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's a bit of luck, and I think Paul Graham talks about that in the article as well, right? In poker, there's this concept called resulting, right? This idea that amateur poker players often think that if they win a hand, they played well, and if they lose a hand, they played badly. Pro poker players know that's not true because there's always a good element of chance. You can get lucky and play badly and win a hand, or you can get unlucky and play perfectly and lose a hand. In fact, that's quite common in poker, right? And it is foolish to take the result and assume that that is a direct definer of your skill. You can try hard and you can fail, right?
Actually, I'm not a big poker player, but I assume actually there are certain hands which have not been dealt in your favor. And the point is actually to lose with the smallest possible loss.
Absolutely. Knowing when to play is a big part of being a good poker player. Know when to hold them, know when to fold them. Like, it's more than just an awesome song.
That's right. And so it's not just about the quality of your idea or the level of your tenacity. It's also about understanding, are you too early? Are you too right? Are the regulatory environments working against you? Do you have bad founder problem fit? Are you in the wrong market? Have you pissed off the wrong industry player? So it's also about understanding the hand you've been dealt as well.
Absolutely. But in the context of a startup, you kind of get to choose the hand you've been dealt, right? Because you can decide what you're building. And so, I think that is an important part of it, is like, making sure you're optimizing for the right conditions. But I guess I just want to go back to the sort of stubbornness concept again. And, ultimately, when's the time to actually quit right? And I think this kind of answers that as well. Another really simple way of framing the difference between persistent and obstinate is a persistent person will try something new each time, whereas the obstinate person will just keep trying the same thing. Now, when a persistent person runs out of new things to try, then they will quit, right? There are some walls that cannot be scaled. There are some problems that you're simply not capable of solving. So once you have gone a few rounds, you have listened, you have learned, you have tried new things, and you have run out of new things to do, that is when you quit, right? Like, you do not always stay persistent forever. Another interesting thing I was thinking about is, I don't know how familiar you are, Chris, with the history of perpetual motion machines, but I think this is a great illustration of the difference between persistence and obstinacy. So there's been this long crackpot tradition for hundreds, possibly thousands of years of people, lone inventors, who are trying to invent a perpetual motion machine. And a perpetual motion machine is some sort of very carefully balanced mechanical machine that somehow never stops moving. And not only that, you're able to somehow extract energy, therefore infinite energy, from that machine. And there are people, they feel like they've gotten so close. It's just somehow there's a little tilt or a little imbalance. And if they just get more bearings or get the balance more accurate, get the machining finer, they'll get it right. But they never do, of course. What is the reason? The reason is that the perpetual motion machine is violating the laws of physics. And no matter how hard you try to do the same thing, it will continue to violate the laws of physics. So at the same time as all of these people who've been trying to build a perpetual motion machine in violation of the laws of physics, we have other people who learn about physics deeply, deeply, deeply. They have the same vision, abundant, limitless energy. But instead of ignoring physics, they dive into it deeper and deeper. They are predatory for knowledge, right? They have this predatory hunger for knowledge. And what have those people achieved? They have achieved solar power, harnessing the energy of the sun for cheap, abundant power. They're getting very close to nuclear fusion, which is effectively the same as a perpetual motion machine, except instead of ignoring the laws of physics, it makes use of deep, deep knowledge, massive experimentation over decades to get there. And so I think, that's the difference. The nuclear fusion people are persistent. The perpetual motion people are obstinate.
Yeah, and it's so interesting, Yaniv, after doing this for almost 30 years, building, operating, and investing in startups, it's so interesting. You can spot it a mile away, right? When you meet a founder and they are clearly off track and they're clearly kind of not connected to the details, and they clearly don't seem to understand the way this works. And when you give them feedback, they're clearly not engaging with the details of your feedback. And you can just tell. You can tell in the first 5 minutes or 10 minutes. Do they have a learner's mindset? Are they confident about what they know while being humble and curious about what you're adding into the mix? It's very hard to explain what combination of behaviors and phraseology, even, and I've said this on one other episode at least, even the way people phrase things reveals a lot about their thinking. So, for example, instead of saying, we are going to revolutionize X, it's more like, we have found a problem with X, and we think that by doing Y, it's going to make a serious impact on that problem. Yeah. Or the phrase, it turns out X is true. It turns out means we did the research, or someone's done the research, and it's been figured. It's been worked out, and this is a surprising fact that people don't generally know. Or the phrase, my instinct is, or our current best thinking about this is. Okay, it leaves this beautiful space for co-creation and learning. It shows conviction about an idea, or even a strong opinion, loosely held. And when I provide feedback, and I'm guilty of this, is the other person jumping in to defend their position, or are they asking one or two follow-up questions to say, tell me more about why you assume that, or why you think that, or what led you to believe that, and before jumping in with their own kind of justifying their own worldview. And so it really, style often belies substance and often belies your thought process, which ultimately can be the difference between your success or failure.
Exactly. So the essay says, obstinacy is a reflective resistance to changing one's ideas. This is not identical with stupidity, but they're closely related. I just love how this guy writes. Yes, that's obstinacy. So the second part of the essay, Chris, which is where I think we should go now, is devoted to analyzing what are the 5 qualities that a person needs to have. And in the context of our show, and in Paul Graham's context too, this is primarily about founders. What are the 5 characteristics that go into making somebody able to practice persistence? The first of these is energy, right? So we talked about the boat. Well, rather, he talked about the boat with the throttle that you can't turn back. There's always going full throttle, right? So in order to be really persistent, you need to have the energy and the imagination to continue to do this, right? Because you are persisting, right? There are a lot of things that will go wrong. You are trying, you are failing. And even if you say, well, failing is the point, we learn from failure, there is still an element of deflation, of setbacks that comes from failing. And you need to have the energy to just pick yourself back up day after day, failure after failure, learn, really listen, practice that open mind. It's not easy because first you failed, and then you're using that failure as a persistent person to learn all the ways in which you were wrong, all the ways in which you screwed up. And so that is really important, right? You always have to be trying new things and having the energy to do so. The second trait that PG says is really important for persistence is imagination, which he kind of characterizes as being able to generate new approaches, right? So you're learning. And what are we saying? Let's say you are faced with a wall, right? And you need to figure out how to get to the other side of the wall. So the obstinate person just runs straight at the wall, hits their head against it, and fails. The persistent person, they'll run straight at the wall, hit their head against it, fail, and then say, well, that didn't work. I've learned that hitting my head against the wall will not cause it to break. What should I do next based on what I know? And that's where imagination comes in, right? This is this sort of like divergent thinking. Should I try to climb the wall? Should I build a tool that dismantles the wall? Should I walk to the end of the wall and walk around it? Should I pay somebody to demolish the wall for me, right? You're really generating ideas, because ideas in this context, they are new hypotheses based on your best understanding of how to solve the problem, that strong opinion loosely held that you have right now. But being able to come up with those ideas, that is in itself a skill. A persistent person lacking an imagination will quickly run out of ideas, and they will revert either to obstinacy, trying the same small number of things they've already tried, or they will give up too early, right? They will quit before they've actually properly explored the problem space.
Yeah, you mentioned divergent thinking. The phrases and words that come to mind for me is, it requires creativity and imagination. It requires first principles thinking, try to rethink the problem from the ground up, because often those walls are domain dogma, cognitive inertia, ill-interpreted regulations or regulations that are getting in your way, and also lateral thinking. I'm often reminded, and I am here, of this interview I saw with Steve Jobs, where he talks about how most people think their job is to sort of understand the boundary conditions and railings of the world and not bump into them too much and sort of stay on the road. And he said the biggest revelation you'll have is when you realize that those boundaries, those roads, were created by people not any smarter than you, and that actually the world is entirely fungible and you can create your own boundary conditions or break all the boundaries and reshape the world to your liking. And there are so many operators, some founders, because if you're a founder, you've probably had some version of this insight anyway, but some founders are still a little, they revert to the mean, they revert to the normal behavior. Certainly a lot of operators in big companies do this, where they're like, well, we're not allowed to do that, or our OKR isn't about that, or that's not what my boss asked me to do, or that's not the requirement, or that's not what the regulation seems to say. And they just sort of give up before they even try. And yeah, it really does require you to look at that wall, and that wall could be a requirement from your boss. It could be the domain dogma from the industry. It could be your customer, and I use that in air quotes, telling you they don't want it that way. And then realizing, actually, maybe they're not my customer. Maybe I should be disrupting them. Maybe that regulation doesn't say exactly what it says, or maybe I can go engage with the regulators about that, or maybe that requirement from my boss or from my partner is just dumb, and I'm going to say, no, I don't want to do that. That's not the way that solve the problem. It really does require that, the creativity, the first principles thinking, the lateral thinking, but it also requires something we talked about recently, Yaniv, well, actually, in one of our back catalog. It requires bravery. It requires the bravery to say no to accepting the existence of the wall as it is and how everybody else has tackled the wall, and to break those boundaries and to try something new.
Well, look, I mean, I think the point is the wall is there and it is standing between you and where you want to go. And so you have lots of options for dealing with that fact. That is your simple fact. The wall is in the way. And like I said, you can try to break it, you can climb it, you can go around it, you can reframe your perspective and realize it's not actually a wall. It just looked like a wall. You can realize that you're heading in the wrong direction. There's another way to get where you're going that doesn't have a wall in the way. So many different things you can do. The only thing that's inevitable here as startup founders, this will hit straight in the fields. The only thing you can be sure of is once you get over, around, through, past that wall, the next thing you will see is another wall, right? Which I think brings us to the next part of the importance of this journey is resilience, right? There is this sort of fractal element of failure that we've touched on already, right? Which is you will fail on a small scale, you will fail on a larger scale. And alongside the energy, which is, I guess, that sort of simple driving force that allows you to keep doing things every day, you have to separate your ego, I would say, your sense of self-worth from this constant failure. And so resilience, as PG says it, is it's not having one's morale destroyed by setbacks. So there's energy, but there's also this sense of, I want to keep trying this. And you need to be able to bounce back from it. And I think far easier said than done, Chris. But so important is this separation of ego, saying that, in a sense, I'm a scientist. A scientist tests hypotheses. And if the hypothesis turns out to have been false, then you have learned something new, just as valid as if the hypothesis turns out to have been true. By the way, even real scientists struggle with this. You'd always rather your hypothesis were true. But the process of science is simply about evaluating these things and then learning and moving on to the next thing. And so resilience is understanding yourself as that scientist.
This requires a great deal of resilience. It also requires a good amount of perspective, right? Understanding that these challenges are part of the journey. The journey is often the point. I know Travis TK at Uber used to say, people don't like problems. They tend to try to avoid problems. And he said, I'm the problem solver in chief. I love problems. He said, imagine a brilliant mathematician who ran out of math problems to solve. He'd be pretty damn bored. His job would be over. He's like, I love solving problems, and we should all love to be solving problems at Uber, he would say. And so it's about also having the perspective to know that these problems, these challenges, these failures, they're part of the process. They're part of the reason why you're building a moat around you, why you're going to succeed where others gave up. And when you look at it that way, resilience becomes not easy or automatic, but it becomes easier because you're no longer feeling as much angst about it. And so, yeah, I think you need a lot of inherent resilience, but a good amount of perspective as well.
So a little word nerd sidebar on this, Chris, because I'm a word nerd, but I think it's relevant about the word resilience, which I think these days sort of seems like a bit of a soft term, but like this is actually a metaphor in itself, the way we use it. And the original meaning of resilience comes from material science. And this is, I've got Wikipedia in front of me now. What resilience of a material is the ability of that material to absorb energy when it is deformed elastically and release that energy upon unloading. Right? So if you think about an elastic band or a very bendy stick, you can pull it back and then it snaps back into place, right? So you deform it and then it releases that energy back to where it was. So I think there's two key aspects of this that really illustrate what it means to be resilient in this context, right? One is you get bent out of shape. In the case of material science, literally. In your case, metaphorically, you try something, it doesn't work. You're like, oh, and then you snap back, right? You snap back into shape. You don't let those failures deform you permanently. And the second piece is in returning to that original shape, you release that energy that went back into you, right? So it's like, yeah, all that energy that went into deforming you, all of that experiment, once you've run the experiment, it kind of comes back and you're re-energized. And so I think these things goes back to that first point from PG, that energy, that sense of like every experiment we try isn't deflating, it is inflating. It energizes me. That is the meaning of resilience. And, I feel like we've kind of lost that harder edge of the word. I think it's actually a fantastic term.
That's exactly right, of course. And I love that metaphor. The bit I'm adding on top is that we as humans sort of have a lot of feelings about these things. We have a lot of stories we tell ourselves about these things. And so if you think of yourself as a stick or as some surface and you're being bent a certain way, and you're thinking of that as like, don't worry, I'll be able to spring back, you have a certain narrative about that. But if you think of yourself as a spring and you say, my job is to bend. My job is to spring back.
Yes.
That's the
Yes.
point of me. And so it changes the narrative and the emotional story around it as well. So it's both.
It actually also gets me thinking about another thing, which is, as you know, in the tech community these days, taking cold plunges is all the rage. And I was doing a bit of reading on these things, and all the science, it makes this distinction between what they call deliberate cold exposure and non-deliberate cold exposure, right? Which is, if you put yourself in a cold plunge, you get bloody cold, but you're doing it because you want to do it. You believe you're going to get energy. You believe you're going to go back and feel healthier, and it has great health effects. But if you get thrown into the ocean out of your control and you just get really cold, then you get hypothermia. And the interesting thing is you get none of the health benefits. So there is a sort of strong mindset, right? So this resilience is this like deliberate failure exposure, you could say, rather than just like failing without realizing it. It's like, you know what? This is the point. This is the point of what I am doing. All the best .coms are taken or crazily overpriced, so you settle on a workaround domain for your website. Don't compromise. Get a clean, sharp .tech domain that instantly says, this is a tech startup. Grab yours at get.tech/TSP for the Startup Podcast or via domain registrars like GoDaddy. Okay, so resilience is point 3. Now, point 4, and Chris, I'm going to hand this one over to you because this is your favorite thing, good judgment, right? Having a rational focus on expected value. So this is what PG says about good judgment. The persistent are quite rational. They focus on expected value. It's this, not recklessness, that lets them work on things that are unlikely to succeed. Good judgment. What say you, Chris?
I've touched on the point of judgment, craft, experience, taste, intuition earlier in the episode, and so of course I agree on the point of judgment here. What I'll add to it is it requires the right kind of optimism. So oftentimes, the accusation against someone who's very disciplined, very focused, very resilient is, oh, you're being idealistic, you're being Pollyannic, you're being academic. And oftentimes what's actually happening is that these people are more optimistic. They're actually more pessimistic about the fears and anxieties and status quo that everybody else has. So they're not optimistic about the thing they're trying to create so much as they're sober about the risks and limits of the way everybody else thinks. Let me give you an example. Your non-entrepreneurial friends will say, oh, Chris, why do you want to go do that? It's so risky. And you have such a stable, good job and you'd have to work so hard and you're risking this and that and whatever. What the entrepreneurial guy, in this case, Chris, believes is actually you are risking more than I am. You're risking the waste of your life energy, of using your precious time working on someone else's dream, on a job that is not any more stable than my entrepreneurial endeavor is. It's a mirage that your job is stable and that you're valued and that you're in a safe place. And that, what I'm doing is harder than what you're doing. Actually tolerating the dead-end job or the status quo that you're tolerating is actually worse. It's just more familiar. It's a risk you're choosing to take because it's more familiar. My wife once said to me this great idea that I've since stolen, which is choose your hard. It's all hard. It's all risky. You could extend it to say choose your risky. Right? Choose your compromise. Yes, I think judgment, as I said in the earlier part of the episode, about how to adapt, what signal to use, how to use it, all this sort of stuff. But I'm adding now judgment about where real risk is. Judgment about where to apply your optimism. Judgment to what to tolerate and what to not tolerate. And to judgment around the status quo that most people, the kind of judgments most people don't even know they're making, and they're making it sort of half asleep, and they're making it in the wrong direction often.
I would also say, like, you're sort of talking about risk at the macro level. I think this also applies at the micro level. And that's what Paul is saying, is that every experiment you run, everything you try is a bet. And most bets, and these are sort of bets with high payoffs and low odds of success. But it doesn't mean you're being reckless. You are thinking very carefully over time which of these bets on an expected value basis are going to result in a really positive result, right? You are not just throwing spaghetti against the wall and seeing what sticks. You are coming up with a thoughtful, iterative plan of experimentation, and you are making smart, bets. And again, I think that's where the poker analogy does come into it pretty nicely. The final thing that goes into making a resilient founder, according to Paul Graham in this article, is focus on a specific goal. So Paul says about this, in practice, your energy and imagination and resilience and good judgment, that was the first 4 things, right? They have to be directed towards some fairly specific goal. Not too specific, or you might miss a great discovery adjacent to what you're searching for, but not too general, or it won't work to motivate you. So again, if we are trying to get through, past, around walls, if we're trying to get somewhere, if we have this powerful throttle, if we are able to marshal all of our skills and personal resilience to do all of this, where are we actually going? Because the one thing you know for sure is if you don't know where you're going, you're not going to get there. And furthermore, you're probably going to run out of patience for the journey if you don't know where you're going. So I think that the point here, and it nearly is a meta point, the meta point here is that this is all goal-directed behavior. Everything you're doing with a startup, all of these characteristics, all of this persistence, it is towards something. And that something is a goal, right? You can't just say, I'm doing all of this work and I'm going to find out what happens. It is not open world exploration. It's goal-directed behavior. And that is that North Star, which is a very commonly used term in these contexts, that gives all the rest of your efforts shape. And it is important to get that right.
Yeah, it's what we've touched on throughout the episode, this idea of falling in love with the problem, not the solution. The problem has to be specific, but not too specific, allow room for exploration. You need to figure out a minimum viable problem, which is usually a subset of that problem so that you can start somewhere. And of course, having a clear and ambitious problem that you believe in, that animates and motivates you and your team, will help you have more resilience. It'll help you be more persistent. And you need to balance against not becoming obstinate because you love that problem far, far too much.
Yeah. So what I love about this essay and this concept, Chris, is it has tentacles. It nearly sits at the heart of so many things that we talk about with startups, right? Falling in love with the problem and not with the solution. Thinking of things as a learning machine, embracing failure, and having that right level of mission and incrementally working your way towards it. All of these things ultimately are the ingredients that go into persistence. And persistence is that engine that drives startup success. So I think this is deep, but it's profound. And it's something that as a founder, it's really important to take to heart, especially those 5 characteristics. And I think it's probably appropriate to leave the final word to Paul Graham in his essay. So the final paragraph, he says, considering what it's made of, it's not surprising that the right kind of stubbornness is so much rarer than the wrong kind, or that it gets so much better results. Anyone can do obstinacy. Indeed, kids and drunks and fools are best at it. Whereas very few people have enough of all 5 of the qualities that produce the right kind of stubbornness. But when they do, the results are magical. Build the thing that builds the thing that builds the thing. That is you as a founder. Build those characteristics, and that is where the magic happens.
Startup success is exceedingly rare, and startup success depends on exceptional founders who are themselves exceedingly rare, who have the characteristics in the right combinations, in the right balance, of which that mix is typically exceedingly rare. It's a difficult game. It's a really difficult game, and it's a difficult game on multiple dimensions, and it will challenge and test you in every way, emotionally, physically, financially, and it will really show you what you're made of. Many of us, most of us, maybe all of us, are susceptible to overestimating ourselves, our competency, our skills, our ideas, our quality of execution. I know for myself, when I was in my small town in Australia growing up, I was always, told by others, oh, Chris, you're so smart. Oh, Chris, you're so effective. Oh, Chris, you're moving so fast. And then I went to Silicon Valley and I was like, I don't know anything. I am not as good as these people. And I had to get much, much better. And then I joined Uber and I was like, holy shit. Everything I thought I was doing that was brilliant and fast and competent, there's a whole other tier. There's a whole other tier. And I'm sure I will find another tier above this again. And so your game just needs to be elevated in order to have that rarefied outcome that we're all aiming for, those unicorn outcomes. So yeah, it's really, really hard. And you've got to really be honest and earnest with yourself. Are you being stubborn or are you being persistent? And are you good enough? Are you working hard enough? Are you working smart enough? And are you cut out for this as well?
Yep, exactly right. And Chris, if people are working on themselves and working on their startup, and they know it's hard, and they know they can't do it alone, and they want some help, I know that this is something that you are passionate about helping people with. So if folks want to get in contact with you and potentially work together, how can they do that?
Yeah, you can learn more about my work over at chrissaad.com/advisory, or join me in the comments on my LinkedIn. I'm having a lot of great conversations on there with my posts, so I'd love to chat to you there. Or subscribe to my newsletter, chrissaad.com/newsletter. How about you, Yaniv?
I'm on LinkedIn trying to make it a less boring place. I love getting connection requests from TSP listeners, so feel free to hit me up there. I am also in the late stages of raising a pre-seed round for my own startup, Violet. So if you are an angel investor keen to learn more, DM me, you can get my deck, and you can maybe learn a little bit more about how I'm thinking of all the different failures that are going to pave the road to success with Violet. All right, Chris, that was a good one as always. And thanks to you, Paul Graham, wherever you are, for providing us this inspiration for another great episode of TSP. That's the pod.
Catch you in the next one. Bye-bye.
Today's episode of the Startup Podcast was brought to you by .tech domains. Naming your startup should be easy, but it isn't, because all the good .com names are taken or wildly overpriced. No more. You don't have to compromise. Your domain shows your focus and intent, so make it sharp, clean, and unmistakably tech with a .tech domain. How do you do that? Head to www.get.tech/TSP or a registrar like GoDaddy and grab your .tech domain today. Get.tech/TSP for the Startup Podcast, so they know you came from us.